Hello, and welcome to today's mini lesson about race relations at the turn of the 20th century. This is a very important topic. We're actually going a little bit beyond in your book where we've been thus far, but this will come up later. But at least one of the people that we talk about doesn't really appear in the book, and I think it's important that you know a bit about that person. But also about how the three people that we're going to talk about relate to each other and how they were kind of different strands in the same general movement. So we're going to talk about them and also just talk about the state of race relations in America in the early part of the 20th centuries. And to say that it was bad, it was bad. According to Dr. James Lowen, who is a sociologist out of the University of Vermont and the author of a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, he declares that this time period was the nadir or the low point of race relations in American history. And that's saying something, given that there was, slavery. So anyway, this was pretty bad. Let's just say that this was a pretty bad time period. During this time period, there were thousands of lynchings going on. You had things like Jim Crow laws, especially in the South. And these included things like just segregation in general. There were places that white people could go and black people couldn't go to those places. And there were certain places where black people could go and white people probably wouldn't go in there. It's not that they couldn't, it's that it was considered to be a black place, or other words that they would use that I'm not going to use. The other couple other things, literacy tests. If you wanted to try and vote, and there were black voters in the South, but dang few of them, because they had to go through a lot of hoops to be able to register to vote. And one of the most common was the literacy test, they designed these tests, and we will actually do one of these when we get to the civil rights movement. But they would design these tests so that they were basically impossible to pass. The instructions were confusing. It included things that no one would really be able to know. Just very confusing, and you could only, I think you could miss one question, or maybe it was none. Anyway, it was almost impossible to pass under those conditions. And then poll taxes. These were things where if you wanted to vote, you had to pay a quarter, a dollar, whatever it was. I'm not sure what it was. But you have to imagine that this really targeted the lowest sector of society, and that was, unfortunately, African Americans, because they tended to be paid the least to do the same jobs. I don't remember what the stat is on that, but it was pretty bad. So would you spend, say, a dollar to go vote, or would you put that money towards, say, feeding your family? And most folks decided, I need to feed my family. I have this to take care of. I have that to take care of. We can't do voting right now. And even if they could, and that was again, literacy tests and other you would even have like county clerks that an African American would go in to register to vote, otherwise qualified, and they would just say, no, you're not allowed to register. I will not register you. And you also had this thing known as the grandfather clause, that we will actually talk about another time, but I just wanted to put it in there. Okay. And the other thing you want to think about in that time period is this wasn't just African Americans experiencing a bad time. Think about Native Americans. Think about our indigenous people here in Montana. And I think one of the movies that you guys watch, if you had Mr. Hartman for Montana, is A River Runs Through It. I think that's still in his rotation. But if you've ever seen that movie or read that book, which if you haven't, do, there is a scene where the brother, Paul, I think it's Paul, takes his Native American girlfriend into a bar in Missoula, and they are thrown out or attempted to be thrown out because she is Native American. They tell him that he's not allowed to have a Native American woman in the bar with him. And that's just one example of that. I mean, the treatment of Native Americans. This was the sort of end of the wars, the government wars against Native Americans. And now white people certainly expected that Native Americans were all going to be on reservations. And that was not necessarily the case. And so here in Montana, we may not have had an issue with African Americans, but we certainly had an issue with Native Americans. Hold on one second. And we're back. Sorry about that. So anyway, moving on to this picture, we have the one on the left here is a picture of the 1921 race riots. I believe that was in Chicago. And you see African Americans just being loaded onto trucks, even though they frequently didn't do anything wrong. If you've ever watched, there's an episode of America, the Story of Us, where a race riot begins because of an altercation at a beach, and it takes over the entire town. And I believe this was a part of that one in 1921. There was also one in 1919. On the upper right there, you have a Klan initiation. And this, you might think, oh, this is in Alabama. This is in Georgia. No, this was in Long Island, New York. So a hop, skip, and a jump away from the most metropolitan city in America, and you have an initiation into the KKK. The KKK had rebounded in the 19 teens, and by the 1920s, they are a major force in American society. And then down at the bottom, it's from this time period, I have no earthly notion what this is. I don't know if this was some sort of family get-together where they're all members of the Klan. Maybe it's a wedding. Maybe it was the costume shop was out of Star Wars stuff. I really don't understand what that is, but it's a big group of people in Klan robes standing in front of a very scary looking thing. I don't know what's in the back there, but that's quite terrifying, really. So anyway, yeah, so this again was a bad period. And for the most part, if there was unrest and it involved at all African Americans, they were the ones that were going to be rounded up, even if they were not the ones that necessarily started the problem. Just like on the beach, it was a guy throwing rocks at the young black people and hit one in the head and killed him. And that guy was not arrested, but several black people were. And that was kind of the way of really any sort of crime. If there was a black person in the vicinity, they were going to get probably charged with the crime, and more often than not, probably convicted, just because they were in the wrong place, wrong time. Now, this is a bit more serious, and I apologize. I should have warned you. If you want to turn your head away from this, it's fine. You may not even know what you're looking at. This is the result of a lynching. And this was very prominent during the late 1800s and even into the early 1900s, heck, into the 1960s. I think it hasn't been that long since America had a year that didn't have a lynching. Now, they were not always like this. Typically, when we think of lynchings, we think of people hanging from a tree, from something, and that they have been strung up by a group of local guys, and it's almost always guys, that get together and decide to take the law into their own hands. Usually something has happened. Typically, you got to think like rape, or only a lot of times it wasn't rape. There are very many times where it was consensual, and so either they assumed that the guy was raping her, or the girl freaked out. Her dad was there, whatever, and said, "Oh, he was raping me," even though later on to find out probably was not. But anyway, the thing that I find interesting not that they are also burning this person. I'm not sure if that's after the lynching or this was the lynching, because it didn't have to be hanging. It could be drowning. It could be, again, burning somebody in a fire. But anyway, what you notice in this picture is not necessarily the man being burned. It is the faces behind him. Take a look at the faces. Any one of them, is anybody trying to cover their face? Anybody looking down going, "Oh my God, what am I doing here?" No, not a single person. Many of them are smiling. They are happy that they have participated in this. And, how can this be? How can a group of people, a group of human beings, take place in the killing of another human being by their own hands? And how can that be? And how can that not weigh on your conscience? Well, two things are possible. Number one, these are all sociopaths. That's pretty tough to believe. I mean, there might be a few in the crowd, but just law of percentages says they're probably not all sociopaths. The second reason is that they view the victim, and I've said this before and I will say it again, as less than fully human. It is very easy to hurt someone or end someone's life if you do not view that person as a human being, or at least as not as much a human being as you are. So that was what I'm not even sure what the place is on this one. But again, the faces in the picture say more than anything. This is a lynching in Duluth, Minnesota. And again, I'm sorry, I should have trigger warned you on this, but you can look away if you need to. But those that are still looking, again, look at the faces. Nobody's hiding, really. They're all wanting to be in the picture. Some of them aren't successful, but they're all wanting to be in the picture. There are smiles, not maybe the giddy smiles of the previous picture, but they are smiling. They are happy. It's Duluth. They're probably cold. Anyway, but the story on this one is that there were 3 African American circus workers, and there was a report of a rape of a white woman. They were immediately accused. I mean, these guys were part of a traveling circus. They were outsiders, and they were black. And so they were falsely accused, and they were lynched, again, without a trial. No shame on the faces, lots of smiles. Again, these men view these victims as less than fully human. And that is how you get this sort of thing. And that was very common in the early part of the 20th century. African Americans were viewed, by and large, by whites as less than fully human. And this is not to make anyone feel bad or anything like this, but we have to understand what has happened in the past if we are to understand the present and the future. We have to. Coming up is another one. It's not quite as shocking because it's pretty much from far away. But on the left, you can see 2 people hanging from a rail. I'm not sure if that's a railroad bridge or just a bridge. But 2 people hanging from a bridge there. And then on the left-hand side, you can see closer up those people. The story on this one, and this is from 1911, May 25th, 1911, by, and it's near Okima, Okfuskee County, sorry, Oklahoma. I apologize to the Oklahomans out there. So the young man in the picture had shot and killed a deputy sheriff on May 2nd. And the posse that was looking for actually a stolen cow found the young man and his mother, and they were both charged, and again, no trial. She had been the first. Oh, wait a minute here. Okay. Anyway, they ended up stringing up both of them, even though the mother was really just guilty of taking her son in at that point. But in any case, this is the mother and her son hanging again from the railroad bridge, and this was sold as postcards, as was the one from Duluth. But they sold this as postcards in this town in Oklahoma for many, many years. These were postcards that you could purchase and send to people in the mail. And again, could you participate in this? I mean, look there's nobody hiding their faces up there. Not that you can see them, it's pretty far away. But it doesn't seem that anybody's ashamed of it. And again, they view these people as less than fully human. Okay, so on to the three people we were going to talk about today. Number one, Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was one of the original kind of, you can say, civil rights leaders. He was an author, educator, public speaker. He was born into slavery, but became, by the late 1800s and the early part of the 1900s, pretty much the voice for Black America. He was influential with politicians in some way. He actually even dined at the White House with, I believe it was President Theodore Roosevelt. But his big thing was that he understood that African Americans currently held basically low jobs, manual labor, farm labor, things like that, factory labor. And what he encouraged African Americans to do was, don't fight that. Don't just do your job, do it well, stay out of trouble. Don't, if somebody attacks you, don't come back at them. Basically, turn the other cheek kind of thing from the Bible. Just, stay positive, stay doing your job, and then sometime, and Washington really felt this could be up to 100 years. But eventually, whites would view African Americans as good partners, good people to be in business with, etc. And African Americans would start to rise. But it could take like 100 years before that was going to start happening. But anyway, Washington founded something called the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. This later goes on to become Tuskegee University. But again, the initial idea of this was to educate African Americans to do better in their jobs that they already have, or maybe like one level up. But don't challenge the status quo too much. Just stay positive and take whatever they throw at you, and eventually things would get better, was kind of the idea. Now, this is from a speech called the Atlanta Compromise from 1895, where Washington basically lays out this. This is just the beginning of it. I have a recording of actual Booker T. Washington saying this. It's a really bad recording. I'll play you just a snippet of it after. I had an AI voice thing do this. So this is not Booker T. Washington speaking here. This is just a very friendly artificial intelligence.
Mr. President and gentlemen of the Board of Directors and citizens, 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race. No enterprise seeking the material, civil, or moral welfare of this section can disregard this element of our population and reach the highest success. I but convey to you, Mr. President and Directors, the sentiment of the masses of my race, when I say that in no way have the value and manhood of the American Negro been more fittingly and generously recognized than by the managers of this magnificent exposition at every stage of its progress. It is a recognition that will do more to cement the friendship of the two races than any occurrence since the dawn of our freedom. Not only this, but the opportunity here afforded will awaken among us a new era of industrial progress. Ignorant and inexperienced, it is not strange that in the first years of our new life, we began at the top instead of at the bottom, that a seat in Congress or the state legislature was more sought than real estate or industrial skill, that the political convention or stump speaking had more attractions than starting a dairy farm or truck garden.
Okay, so again, he's talking about this exposition they're attending, and then he's sort of getting to the point down here that African Americans during Reconstruction started, in his opinion, to basically going too far. That they were going for seats in Congress and the legislature instead of keeping at their kind of low level and acquiring sort of more property and prestige and honor and things like this, and that would have been better than trying to, go in his belief, sort of whole hog into politics and whatnot. I am just going to briefly let you hear his actual voice on this recording.
Mr. President and gentlemen of the Board of Directors and citizens, 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race.
Yeah, so I just wanted to let you hear that. So Washington again was sort of the one of the first civil rights leaders, such as they were in American history, and coming up into prominence in the early part of the 20th century is an academic, author, sociologist, activist named W.E.B. Du Bois, and that is actually how you pronounce his name, W.E.B. Du Bois. And he believed in, as I say here, legal confrontation. So what that really meant was that for Du Bois, he wanted things to go faster. He thought that African Americans deserved more of a seat at the table, and that working within the system, so advocating Congress to change things and leading protests and things like this, was the best way to get meaningful change for African Americans in the country at this time. So one of the big differences between these two guys, Booker T. Washington was born during slavery. Du Bois was born well after slavery ended, and in Massachusetts, where slavery had never been much of a thing in the first place, whereas Washington was born in the South. Again, educator, sociologist, historian, activist. He was the first African American to earn a doctorate from Harvard in sociology. He actually did have an undergrad from Fisk University, and Harvard made him get another BA because they would not accept credits or a degree from Fisk University, which was an historically black college, or university, I guess I should say, historically black university. But yeah, so they made him retake basically an entire undergraduate, and then he was given a scholarship, there we go, into the doctorate sociology program at Harvard. In 1905, he founded, along with a bunch of other sort of leading African-American figures of the time, founded something called the Niagara Movement, which was basically organized to oppose racial segregation and disenfranchisement. Its members felt that the policy of accommodation and conciliation without voting rights, which was promoted by Booker T. Washington, was what they called unmanly. That basically, regardless of how they're treated, if they don't have the right to vote, are they really men? Are they are they really people in our society? And Du Bois basically said no. Du Bois opposed Booker T. Washington and the Atlanta Compromise, basically with the feeling that this was not a successful way to move forward, that it was going to take way too long, and that black people are people now. So he also published a book called The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, huge seminal work in the African American community, and founded not only the NAACP magazine, The Crisis, but he was also one of the co-founders of the NAACP, which we talked about in a little bit in class the other day. And he attended not only the Pan-African Congress, but he was an observer at the peace conference at Versailles after World War I. And he came away from that very angry at the fact that the white powers were basically not giving any of the African powers, or even other areas, weren't giving them the ability to have their own countries, or at least even govern themselves. It just wasn't happening. And so he felt very angry about that. So from Du Bois, this was, he kind of came into being an activist when he witnessed the result of a lynching of a young man. Like, as he was walking down the road, he found the man's burned knuckles. And that really sort of shook him. And he said, in looking back at it, he said, one could not be, oh, here, I'm going to play it for you. Never mind.
One could not be a calm, cool, and detached scientist while Negroes were lynched, murdered, and starved. The cure wasn't simply telling people the truth. It was inducing them to act on the truth.
Yeah. So after seeing that, he realized he couldn't just be detached from this whole thing. And he needed to get people involved. He needed them to act on what the truth was at this time, which was things were pretty darn bad. And that was in 1899. So he kind of comes up from that. But he was visiting the South. And it was one of the first time, I think it was the first time he'd been in the South. And he witnessed the reaction and the aftermath of this lynching. And finally, Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey he is mentioned in the book. The one that's not is W.E.B. Du Bois. Fascinating. But anyway, Marcus Garvey was from Jamaica originally, and he came to the United States, and his whole thing was that Africans they couldn't live side by side with whites. That was just not possible. So blacks, African Americans, needed to separate themselves from white society. And one of the best ways that they could do that, according to Garvey, was to go back to Africa. Return to Africa. Back to Africa was kind of a big thing for him. And so he came to the United States, and he had several businesses. And he founded something called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which he had actually founded back in, I think it was Jamaica. And he was opening a branch in Brooklyn in New York. And so UNIA, and also African Communities League, ACL. And he, as a part of this, he declared himself Provisional President of Africa. And he would actually go around in outfits like the one you see here. And he felt that when they all finally went back to Africa, that he was going to be, he wanted like one government in Africa, and he wanted to be the head of it. So he had some definite dictatorial ambitions. But again, he didn't feel that black people and white people could live in an integrated society. So I'm going to play you, I have a speech of his, and I just want to play it for you. And I would advise you to please watch the screen. Hopefully this doesn't get content blocked. But watch the screen, because he's a little hard to understand. He has a very thick Jamaican accent. And if you don't look at the screen, then it's a little bit tough. So here you go.
Did not suffer and die to give me an education to slight, oppress, or discourage my people. Because whatsoever education I acquired out of their sacrifice of over 300 years, I shall use for the salvation of the 400 million black people of the world. And the day when I forsake my people, may God Almighty say there shall be no more life for you. I unequivocally rejected the racist assumption of much white American Christianity, namely that God had created the black man inferior and that he had intended Negroes to be a servant class, hewers of wood and drawers of water. Well, I predicated my view of man on the doctrine of Imago Dei. All men, regardless of color, are created in the image of God. Now, from this premise followed the equality of all men and the brotherhood of all men. The biblical injunction of Acts 17:26 reminds us that he created of one blood all nations of men that dwell on the face of the earth. I was most interested in brotherhood within his own race, because if Negroes are created in God's image and Negroes are black, then God must, in some sense, be black.
Okay, so again, I'll cut that off there, and I forgot to open up this slide, so I'll just show it to you now. Maybe? No, it won't let me. Okay, you can read it off of here. So for today, your journal activity is number one, I want you to describe the relationship between Black America and white America during the late 19th and 20th centuries. Again, not expecting a master's treatise, just give me a sentence or two, okay? That's all I'm asking. And then I want you to briefly compare and contrast the three leaders we covered today. So what were they trying to do? What was the same about them? What was different about them? Okay, that's compare and contrast. And then which leader's vision had the best chance of success and why? Okay, so all of that if you're in the online class, that goes into the seminar journal assignment or the video journal assignment on Moodle. And if you're in person, that goes into the Tuesday journal activity post in Google Classroom, in your classrooms, in your class's Google Classroom. So again, describe the relationship between Black and white America during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Briefly compare and contrast the three leaders we covered today. How are they the same? How are they different? How were their goals the same, different? And which leader's vision had the best chance of success and why? Please explain your thinking. Okay, that's it. So thank you. Hopefully see you tomorrow.